So you have a garden, and you have man, you have woman representing humanity, and you have God. Now, there's a lot of ink been spilled on, did this happen or did this not happen? Is there a real garden? Can we trace a real garden? Can we trace real people? Where would this be? Is the Bible accurate in this sense? Well, the beauty of the Genesis story is not so much that it happens, but as one smart guy says, that it happens. I think when you hear a story about someone telling you not to do something, we can all pretty much relate to doing it and to wanting a little bit more power. The temptation always promises a little bit more than it can deliver. It always what's the expression? Over promises, under delivers. That's the nature of temptation. And this is exactly what happened in the garden. So, for whatever reason, the situation became unsustainable, and humanity, the man and the woman, were kicked out of the garden. And that's where we find ourselves. But one really interesting and beautiful detail of the story, the Eden story, is that prior to their mistake, the man and the woman were naked, and part of their awareness, part of their eating the fruit and becoming more aware of good and bad, good and evil, is that they realize that their nakedness. They have this they become conscious that they're naked. And God has no choice, we're told, but to expel them from the garden. But before he does that, he gives them clothes, which may not sound like an important detail, but it's kind of like the very first hint, the very first allusion that this God deeply cares and scolds. I don't know if he scolds, but let's go with that for now. Scolds and then makes clothes as they go out into the world, as they go out into their new consciousness. It says, and Lord God made clothes for them to cover themselves up. So it's like a parting gift almost, but it's a really beautiful detail that reminds us that he's a loving, we're told he's a loving and caring God, down to the very last detail. Now, real quick, a tiny bit of history. So this story, this Genesis story, which is a very, very controversial story because it discusses origins of the world, origins of the universe, origins of people, animals. This has led to a lot of argumentation, a lot of debates about how much can we trust this, because science, by and large, has disproved a lot of it from a literal point of view. But one of the things, if you do happen to ever pick up a Bible and read a Bible, probably the question you should ask yourself when you're reading anything is not, did this happen? Is this true in a literal sense? But what does this tell us about this God? The people who are writing Genesis in particular were writing it in a time, in a place where everyone had their God. There's hundreds of different gods, and they all did different things. There was, I don't know, the God of the harvest, the God of rain, the sun God, the moon God. So the person who's writing this story, this creation account we call it, writes this story, and the right question, I believe, to ask when you read this story is not did it happen or did it not happen, but what does this tell us about your God? The God that you're presenting, what does this tell us about your God? That is the key question to ask, I believe, when you're reading stuff like this. And when you ask that question, I think it unlocks a lot more beauty, a lot more grace, a lot more power in the story than if you just read it as some sort of scientific or unscientific explanation as to origins. So, for example, at the very, very start of Genesis, it says something like God created the sun and the moon. Well, people worshipped the sun and the moon back then. They were gods themselves. So what this writer is saying is, my God created your gods. And the gods of the time, what you had was you had temples. Everyone had a temple. Every god had a temple. And what people did was, I'm in the woods again, just FYI. every god had a temple in the city. So all the cities were filled of temples. So if you happen to worship a particular god, you could go to that god's temple. And you could go into the temple and you could worship that god. And in that temple, there would be a image of that god. There'd be an image of that god that you could worship. I'm still afraid of cougars. There'd be an image of that god that you could worship. I mean, that kind of makes sense. You go into the temple, there's an image of that god, and you bow down and you worship that god. Now, what the writer of Genesis, one of the many things the writer of Genesis, the first book of the Bible, is telling us is the way this God works, the way this God that I'm writing to you about works, is the creation is his temple. Everything around us is his temple. And then it says, they created man and woman in his image. So they're taking this idea of an image of a God in a temple in like the cities, in, you know, the nearby cities, and they're saying, no, this is much bigger. This is much, much bigger. The creation, the world is there. This is God's temple. And the images of this God is going to be people. We are the images. So there's a later stipulation in the Bible that says you will never make an idol or an image of this God, this Christian God, or at the time, this Jewish God, let's say. Even then, way back, it wasn't quite a Jewish God, but what would become the Jewish God. There was a commandment, you may have heard of the Ten Commandments, and they say you will not make an idol or an image of this God. He forbid it, right? You can't do it. Now why? Why would he say that? Is it an insecurity thing? No, it's because we are that image. It says very early in Genesis that we are the image. There's only one image of this God, and it's going to be humanity, which actually puts a ton of responsibility on us. And I think a couple of videos ago I talked about identity, and our identity comes from without. Well, this again alludes to that there's a huge responsibility, and this God from the very first page of the Bible is deeply on our side, holds us in very, very high esteem, and has this great vision and this hope and this desire for us. There's no other thing in all of creation that can handle the weight of bearing the image of God, and we are it. A little further explanation on Genesis. Maybe I got too into it there. I'm honestly, like I said, the bells went at 6:15, so I kind of took the waking up at sunrise thing out of my own hands, because sunrise here is 6:35 and I was up at 6:15, so another day done. Yeah, more tomorrow.